Greetings folks, Iolair here, and today I'll be talking about secondary builds in World of Warships. This topic has historically invoked significant debate, and more recently the increased presence of carriers in matches challenges the practicality of these builds further, so I thought it would be a good time to cover the topic. Our video today includes two replays of ships with secondary builds. The first features myself sailing the tier-IX German battleship, the Friedrich der Große, and the second match features my colleague Darkwing Glacier sailing the premium tier-VIII U.S. Navy battleship, the USS Massachusetts. I have a couple of objectives for this video. The first is to help you understand some choices and trade-offs of secondary builds, and the second is to offer guidance on how I approach these builds. Now, to be clear, I don't intend to advocate either for or against secondary builds. While I and many others personally like playing with them, there are sound arguments for other choices, especially survivability builds. A couple of points before we get to the main topic. This is the second video where I've prepared the entire commentary in advance. I'm hoping this translates into a higher quality and more watchable video, but I also hope the commentary doesn't come off as too stilted or unnatural. I'm sure you guys will let me know in the comments. During the video, I will share various builds that include recommendations for commander skills and ship upgrades. Choices of skills and upgrades with a dark blue background are generally considered essential to a secondary build, and choices with a lighter blue background are commonly taken on secondary builds but are not necessarily essential depending upon the ship and preferences of the player. Choices with a dark green background are generally considered essential for ship survivability, and those with a lighter green background are common in survivability builds, but again vary depending upon the ship and player preferences. And then there are choices with a dark gray background that do not pertain to either secondaries or survivability, being entirely dependent on the ship and player requirements. So let me first start with a little background and history on secondary builds. For those unfamiliar with these builds and their intended benefits, secondary builds improve the performance of a ship's secondary battery to increase the amount of damage a ship can deliver. A secondary battery, often referred to as simply secondaries, is comprised of guns with caliber smaller than a ship's main battery. Aiming and firing of secondaries at opposing ships are normally handled automatically by the game, and for most ships, damage contribution from secondaries is usually nominal. However, many battleships have large and powerful complements of secondaries, which have the potential to deliver significant amounts of damage, so these ships are the primary candidates for secondary builds. These builds combine select commander skills and ship upgrades to improve the range and accuracy of a ship's secondary battery. Ships with these builds can be quite intimidating to players who face them, and this can facilitate strong area control by driving off some opponents while melting others under the withering impact of damage from the secondaries. For many, the playstyles associated with secondary builds can be quite exhilarating. However, as I'll discuss later, these builds have some trade-offs since they can be quite specialized and situational. Yamato historically had the greatest secondary range of all battleships, and many players implemented secondary builds on her. While less common today, this mighty vessel still retains the potential for a formidable secondary build. The German battleships, when introduced in August 2016, brought longer range and higher volume secondaries to encourage close engagements by these ships. These battleships exemplified the brawling playstyle, which was well received by the community, and in turn secondary builds became the norm for the German battleships, especially starting at tier 8 with the Bismarck. Now, since then, secondary builds have also become popular on other ships, including the upper tier French battleships, the U.S. Navy battleship USS Massachusetts, and the recently released USS Georgia. Enthusiasm for secondary builds among many in the community has declined over the last couple of years, however, with detractors questioning the practicality of these builds. A key argument is that secondary builds require commitment to specialized and opportunistic commander skills and ship upgrades. The prevailing opinion is to invest instead in skills and upgrades that are considered universally beneficial by improving a ship's survivability, concealment, and main battery performance. These so-called survivability or tank builds are intended to improve ship endurance and encourage more consistent and less risky gameplay than the brawling play styles associated with secondary builds. The argument for survivability builds also points to metas with battleships playing in positions where secondaries are ineffective, especially in competitive arenas like clan and ranked battles. Now, some players who advocate for survivability builds even openly express contempt for secondary builds and the players who use them, claiming those who use secondary builds are trying to compensate for poor skills. Now, personally, I think such a position is inaccurate and frankly a little harsh. While I obviously cannot speak for the entire playing community, I do know and observe many skilled battleship players who enjoy and succeed in ships with secondary builds. Moreover, I believe what type of build an unskilled battleship player uses has limited bearing on their contribution in a match. Their performance would generally be about the same either way. I would welcome feedback from proponents of survivability builds to add their perspective here and to improve my representation of the argument. Now, more recently, the increased presence of carriers in matches further complicates the viability of secondary builds. The argument here is that secondary builds not only provide inadequate AA defense, but that positioning of teams for mutual AA support makes secondary engagements even more risky and rare. In turn, some players are now foregoing secondary builds and instead are implementing AA or survivability builds, a point Notzer himself covered in a recent video where he abandoned the secondary build on his Bismarck. I'll leave a link to Notzer's video in the description below. Again, my aim here is not to talk you into either a secondary or a survivability build. The rationale associated with recommending survivability builds is very sound. However, there is significant intangible enjoyment that many players have with using secondary builds. Ultimately, the preference for the playstyles associated with each of these builds is up to the individual player. Okay, so what's my take on all of this? Do I think secondary builds are still viable? Well, I've always enjoyed the playstyle and challenge that comes with successfully leveraging secondary builds, so I'm admittedly and somewhat emotionally reluctant to abandon them. For now, I'm continuing to play with secondary builds because I have not found the current meta as so problematic to discourage their use, and if I felt secondary builds were to become unviable, I would probably simply stop playing the brawlers or play them a lot less. I feel respecting them to a common or universal build dilutes their character and makes the game less interesting. From this point in the video, I'll assume you want to use or at least understand more about secondary builds, so I'll concentrate the discussion on how I approach them. I'll acknowledge up front that ironically, some of my guidance plays into the argument for survivability builds. My general philosophy on secondary builds looks to strike a balance between supporting the brawling playstyle while maximizing team play. Again, this is just my perspective. Guidance on secondary builds varies quite widely between more conservative positions like mine compared with very aggressive builds that maximize secondaries in lieu of other choices. Finally, secondary builds are materially useful only on battleships. Secondary builds on other classes of ship can be interesting novelties, but are outside the scope of what I want to cover here. I'll start my guidance with what I call my, quote, axioms for secondary builds. My first axiom is players should adopt good general battleship practices. Contribution from secondary batteries should be a byproduct of good battleship play, not its goal. In other words, don't play in a way to cater to use of secondaries. Failure to successfully leverage secondary builds mostly falls into two categories. Firstly, some players are overly confident and anxious to brawl, often overextending, resulting in them being focused into oblivion very quickly, and I have personally been the poster child for this condition in the past. Secondly, I think we all observe many battleship players, whether they have secondary builds or not, who play too passively. They tend to play at long ranges, which results in little or no contribution from secondaries, even when good opportunities arise. Good battleship practices require developing strong situational awareness and knowledge of good positioning and timing. This knowledge helps develop the sense of when it's viable to push in and brawl and when to back off. For me, learning these practices, especially situational awareness, comes through self-reflection, recognizing and correcting mistakes. I have found that actively playing with or reviewing replays with someone who knows good tactics is very helpful in pointing out opportunities and mistakes. My second axiom of secondary builds is to accept that leveraging secondaries is often dependent on conditions the player cannot directly control. The reality is that in many matches, suitable conditions to leverage secondaries may be limited or never develop. Secondary engagements often require opponents to put themselves in exposed positions, especially where those opponents are overextended. Players with secondary builds can control how rapidly they approach opponents where secondaries can engage, but related to the first axiom, such engagements should be the result of good positioning and timing and not due to overextending. My third axiom of secondary builds is to mostly not compromise main battery performance in order to improve secondary battery performance. Other than a few exceptional matches, the majority of damage done in a game should always come from the main battery. Reducing main battery survivability and damage production just to improve secondary performance is almost always a losing trade-off. This factor mainly impacts upgrade considerations, which I'll discuss later. My fourth axiom of secondary builds is that they are most viable at tiers 8 and higher. At tier 7, secondary builds can be implemented, although the longest secondary ranges are only 8 kilometers. This range works okay when a player is top tier, but 8 kilometers is often dangerously close when a tier 7 ship is in a tier 8 or tier 9 match. At tier 6 and below, I strongly recommend against secondary builds entirely. This is because the manual fire control for secondary armament skill, which is essential in secondary builds, provides very little benefit at tier 6 and below. Instead, I recommend players use survivability builds at these lower tiers. Finally, I generally recommend builds that blend secondaries and survivability. Being in secondary range means being exposed to take substantial damage, so it's important to balance the damage that secondaries can inflict against the need to absorb and repair damage. A derivative of this point is to avoid what I call, quote, all-in secondary builds. These builds combine as many skills and upgrades as possible expressly to improve secondaries at the cost of ignoring other important considerations. In my opinion, these builds are simply too imbalanced and specialized. Okay, so given these so-called axioms, I'll now offer my recommendations on specifications for secondary builds. Firstly, while a player may establish a secondary build on any battleship of any nation, in practice, secondary builds are most common on upper-tier German and French battleships, as well as the U.S. Navy battleships USS Massachusetts and USS Georgia. These ships have the longest base secondary ranges of at least 7 kilometers, allowing them with the right skills and upgrades to push their secondaries well beyond 10 kilometers and most beyond 11 kilometers. The Japanese battleships Izumo, Yamato, and Musashi have a base secondary range of 7 kilometers, and while secondary builds are potentially viable, such builds are uncommon given the long-range artillery playstyle of these ships. U.S. Navy battleships Iowa, Missouri, and Montana, as well as the Royal Navy battleship Conqueror and Soviet battleship Kremlin, have a base secondary range of 6 kilometers, allowing them with a secondary build to reach a maximum range of 9 kilometers. Now, such builds are technically viable, but are suboptimal and very uncommon given the playstyle of these ships. The remainder of upper-tier battleships have a base secondary range of 5 kilometers, which at best can be increased to only 7.6 kilometers, so I simply recommend against secondary builds for such ships. My baseline specification for a secondary build includes skills and upgrades to improve both the secondary battery and ship survivability. To improve secondaries, take the advanced firing training and manual fire control for secondary armament commander skills, as well as the secondary battery modification 1 upgrade for slot 3. The advanced firing training or AFT skill and secondary battery modification 1 upgrade each increase the range of secondaries by 20%, so the compound effect of both increases range by 44%. The manual fire control for secondary armament skill, which most refer to as simply manual secondaries, decreases the dispersion of secondaries by 60%. This dispersion reduction is crucial to the viability of a secondary build. Without this skill, secondary battery accuracy is simply too poor to produce meaningful damage, as the vast majority of secondary shells do not reliably hit targets beyond 2 or 3 kilometers. The secondary battery modification 1 upgrade also decreases secondary battery dispersion by 20%, and when combined with the manual secondary skill, dispersion decreases by 68% overall. Note that this baseline build includes 2 level 4 commander skills requiring a commander with at least 14 skill points. A commander with fewer skill points, in my opinion, really isn't viable for a secondary build. It's also important to note that a commander with the manual secondary skill requires the player to explicitly select the opponent which the secondaries fire upon. While using this skill and without selecting a target, secondary batteries simply do not fire at all. To target an opponent with secondaries, just hold down the control key and click on the target ship. To improve ship survivability, take both damage control system upgrades in slot 2 and 4, as well as the superintendent skill to provide an additional repair party charge. Now, some hardcore secondary fans are cringing at my exclusion of the basic firing training skill in the base recommendation. Basic firing training, or BFT, reduces reload time of secondary guns by 10%, providing a roughly 11% average increase in secondary hits in a given amount of time. The argument here is that taking BFT allows secondaries to do more damage more quickly, and while mathematically this is true, in practice I have found the alpha burst increase to be only modest. Instead, I recommend spending those 3 skill points on survivability skills that support staying in the game longer. Extended survival time means not only a chance for more secondary battery hits, but it also allows firing more main battery salvos, increasing damage output even further. Now, to be clear, I recommend against BFT expressly for improving secondary battery performance. It may very well be sensible to take BFT as part of an anti-air build, particularly in the current carrier-heavy meta. However, discussion of AA builds is a separate topic that I won't cover here. Once the baseline skills and upgrades are taken, there are a few additional considerations. The first of which is whether to take the inertia fuse for HE skill, which most refer to as simply IFHE. For French battleships, secondary builds effectively require this skill. The majority of secondary guns on French battleships are 100mm, with a base penetration of only 16mm, and this is ineffective against the vast majority of ships at tier 8 and higher. IFHE increases the penetration of the 100mm guns to 21mm, enough to penetrate all superstructures of all ships, most destroyer surfaces, and a few upper-tier cruiser bows and sterns. For the US Navy and Japanese battleships, IFHE is arguably less crucial since most or all of the secondaries are 127mm or larger, providing a base penetration of at least 22mm. Taking IFHE increases the penetration of the 127mm guns to 27mm, which is effective against most upper-tier cruiser bows and sterns, but not that of upper-tier battleships. Now we get to the German battleships, where secondary builds are most common. As much as others may disagree, in my opinion, IFHE for the German battleships is entirely optional. Secondary batteries of 128mm and 150mm, as well as the Freddy's 105mm guns, receive the 1/4 penetration benefit, allowing them without IFHE to get reliable alpha damage against some battleships, as well as the vast majority of cruisers and destroyers. The main benefit of taking IFHE here is to improve alpha damage against battleships where the 128mm and the Freddy's 105mm secondaries can penetrate above 32mm. This leads me to why I am currently trying IFHE on my Freddy. Quasi-scientifically, I find my average damage has increased by about 10,000 per 100 secondary hits, but this is at the cost of not taking basics of survivability. I don't feel I've played enough games yet to be confident that taking IFHE is worth the investment. I should note that at the time I was preparing this video, Wargaming announced plans in 0.8.6 to buff the Bismarck and Tirpitz 105mm secondaries to receive the 1/4 penetration benefit as well. If you elect to not take IFHE, I recommend investing those 4 points in survivability skills, notably basics of survivability to shorten the duration of floods and fires, or fire prevention to reduce the number of fires that can be present on a ship. The next consideration is whether to take the Auxiliary Armaments Modification 1 upgrade in slot 1 to improve the survivability of secondary batteries. This upgrade can be useful, but it means giving up the main Armaments Modification 1 upgrade, which improves the survivability of the main battery. Taking the Auxiliary Armaments Modification upgrade requires a player be confident their ship's main battery is robust enough to not be easily disabled or destroyed. If they're unsure or simply want to choose the safer option, taking the main Armaments Modification 1 upgrade is the better choice. I should note that the description of the Auxiliary Armaments Modification 1 upgrade can be confusing. The expression, quote, plus 100% to secondary battery survivability, unquote, means the hit points of the secondary battery are doubled, not that the survivability of the battery is guaranteed. Next, there's the question of whether to take the Secondary Battery Modification 2 upgrade in slot 6 to reduce secondary battery reload time. Simply put, I recommend against taking this upgrade. Improving main battery reload time or main battery accuracy provides much more reliable potential to inflict increased damage than the inconsistent potential associated with secondary engagements. Instead, I recommend either the main battery modification 3 upgrade available to all battleships at tier 9 and tier 10 to reduce main battery reload time, or the artillery plotting room modification 2 upgrade available to tier 9 and tier 10 US Navy battleships. Players of the Große Kurfürst, Republik, and Yamato may alternatively elect to take these ships' respective legendary upgrades in slot 6. Finally, when available to a player, I recommend mounting the Mike Yankee Success 6 combat signal for ships with secondary builds. This signal improves secondaries by increasing their range by 5%, reducing their dispersion by 5%, and reducing their reload time also by 5%. There are a number of signals that are universally beneficial for ship survivability regardless of build, and you can get details on these signals and their function in the World of Warships wiki. I'll leave a link to the page on signals in the description below. I've tried to cover the main considerations with regard to secondary builds. There are a number of other variants and specialized use cases which are impractical to cover in a single video. I will, however, touch on a couple of common variants here. Firstly, some players prefer to take the Aiming Systems Modification 1 upgrade in slot 3 instead of the Secondary Battery Modification 1 upgrade. This alternate improves main battery performance by reducing main battery dispersion, but comparatively reduces secondary battery range as well as increasing secondary battery dispersion, each by about 13%. These players prefer the trade-off to improve secondary battery performance at the cost of somewhat fewer secondary hits. A more specialized use case involves the USS Massachusetts and USS Georgia, which receive a built-in 40% dispersion reduction for their secondary batteries. This automatically gives them most of the benefit that the manual secondary skill provides, and for this reason some players decline taking the manual secondary skills for these ships' commanders, choosing to put those 4 points into other skills. In the end, I see that there's no correct or best option whether to implement secondary builds or not, and which variants to implement. Like most things, strengthening your ship systems, whether that be secondaries, AA, torpedoes, etc., is often situational. Sometimes the investment helps a lot, sometimes it has no impact, and sometimes the investment detracts from what would actually be useful for a specific match. Ultimately, everything comes down to what you want to experience and heighten your enjoyment of and success in the game. If you're unsure about which builds better suit you for a particular ship, I suggest you play different builds each for several battles and see what you can learn to play well, succeed in, and enjoy. Whatever you do, I hope the input here has been useful, and I wish you fun and success in the game. I welcome you to share your experiences in the comments below. Thanks again for watching, and as always, we hope to see you out there, and we wish you happy sailing.